Chapter 2. The Enemy Evolves. Part 1. They learned. At first, the victory at Kelros felt like control had finally returned, like the war had shifted just enough to give the coalition something they hadn't had in a long time, a sense that maybe they were no longer just surviving, that maybe they had found a way to fight back. And for a brief moment, that belief spread faster than any fleet ever could, reaching systems that had already accepted defeat and forcing them to reconsider, to hesitate, to hope again. But while the coalition focused on what they had achieved, the humans focused on what the Varkh had done. Every second of the battle was studied, not for confirmation of victory, but for signs of change, subtle differences that most would ignore, tiny delays that disappeared by the end of the engagement, targeting shifts that became more precise, defensive reactions that came earlier than they should have. And once those details were isolated, once they were placed side by side, something became impossible to deny. The Varkh had not just reacted, they had learned. And that changed everything, because before Kelros, the Varkh were adapting to patterns they had seen before, predictable structures, repeated strategies, behaviors that followed logic. But now they were adapting to something completely different, something faster, something less structured, something that didn't follow rules. They were adapting to humans. And humans were not predictable. That realization didn't spread publicly, not at first, because it carried something dangerous with it, something that could break the fragile hope that had just begun to form. So instead it stayed contained within command structures, within analysis rooms, within conversations that ended in silence more often than answers. Then the next engagement happened. It was supposed to be routine, a response to a Varkh presence detected near a secured system, a chance to reinforce control, to apply what had been learned at Kelros, to prove that the victory wasn't isolated, that it could be repeated. A joint fleet was deployed, human and coalition ships moving together, still adjusting to each other's methods, still learning how to operate as a single force, but confident enough to engage. And when they arrived, something was wrong. The battlefield didn't feel the same. The Varkh weren't advancing. They weren't overwhelming the system with chaotic pressure. They were waiting, positioned, organized, watching. That stillness alone was enough to trigger unease across the fleet, because it didn't match anything that had been observed before. It didn't fit the pattern of an enemy that consumed everything in its path without hesitation. This was different. And then they moved, not as a wave, not as a swarm, but as a structure. They split instantly, breaking into smaller units, targeting specific ships instead of engaging the fleet as a whole, isolating, dividing, forcing separation in a way that felt intentional, calculated, precise. And within seconds, the shift became clear. They weren't fighting the coalition anymore. They were hunting humans. The first human ship was surrounded before it could fully reposition, its movement restricted, its path controlled, not through overwhelming force, but through prediction. Every angle it tried to take already anticipated, every adjustment countered before it could create space. Then the strike came. Not chaotic, not overwhelming, precise, targeting propulsion first, reducing mobility, then weapons, limiting response, then structure, breaking the ship apart piece by piece. Not instantly, not like before, but methodically, as if the Varkh were testing something, refining something, confirming something. And just like that, the first human ship was lost. No one said anything. No one needed to, because that moment carried more weight than any previous loss. It wasn't just a ship. It was proof. Proof that the advantage humanity brought into the war was already being challenged, already being studied, already being broken down. The battle continued, but it didn't feel the same. Not like Kelros, not like a breakthrough, but like resistance under pressure, like something pushing back just as hard as it was being pushed. Human ships adapted, increasing speed, changing vectors, breaking patterns even further, trying to regain the unpredictability that had given them the edge. But the Varkh responded faster now, adjusting earlier, reacting with less delay, closing the gap between them with every exchange. Coalition ships struggled to keep up, caught between two systems of warfare that operated at different speeds, trying to adapt while already under pressure, trying to survive in a battlefield that no longer followed familiar rules. Another human ship went down. Then another. Not many, but enough. Enough to make it real. Enough to make it undeniable. The Varkh were catching up. By the time the fleet managed to push them back, forcing a retreat, securing the system, the outcome was clear, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. This wasn't a victory. It was a warning, because the difference between Kelros and now wasn't just numbers. It was evolution. The Varkh had faced something new, and they had started to understand it. Back on Earth, the report arrived without delay, detailed, complete, impossible to misinterpret, and as the data was reviewed, as the patterns were confirmed, as the losses were acknowledged, one conclusion became unavoidable. The window was closing. President Morrison didn't speak immediately, didn't rush the response, because she understood what this meant at a level that went beyond strategy, beyond tactics, beyond individual battles. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about time. How long? She finally asked, her voice calm, but carrying weight. Dr. Bennett didn't hesitate. Before they fully adapt to us. A brief pause. Then, not long. And that answer didn't end the discussion. It defined it. Because now the war had entered a new phase. One where victory wasn't determined by strength alone, or technology, or numbers, but by something far more dangerous. Adaptation, speed, learning. And for the first time since humanity entered the war, there was no certainty they would stay ahead. Part 2. The first real loss. At first, they told themselves it was just a setback, something expected in a war that was changing this fast, something that could be corrected with adjustments, better coordination, faster response times. But the truth was already there, quietly forming beneath every report, every analysis, every attempt to explain what had just happened. The Varkh were no longer reacting. They were anticipating. That difference didn't just change the battlefield. It changed the balance of the entire war, because for the first time since humanity entered the conflict, their greatest advantage, speed, unpredictability, independent thinking, was no longer enough to guarantee control. And that became clear during the next engagement. It wasn't a major system, not strategically important, not heavily populated, just another point along the expanding edge of the war, the kind of place that would have been considered safe only weeks before, now turned into a testing ground without anyone realizing it. The fleet sent there wasn't small. It wasn't experimental. It was strong, balanced, prepared, a combination of experienced human crews and coalition forces that had already fought together, already adapted to each other, already proven they could survive. And still, it wasn't enough. The moment they entered the system, something felt wrong, not in the usual way, not like the silence of abandoned worlds or the chaos of incoming attacks, but something deeper, something harder to define, like the battlefield itself had been prepared. The Varkh were already there, not advancing, waiting, again, but this time more organized, more precise, more aware. Human ships reacted instantly, adjusting formation, increasing distance, preparing to break into independent vectors the moment combat started. But before any of that could fully unfold, the Varkh moved. And this time, they were faster, not just in speed, in timing. They didn't wait for engagement. They didn't allow space to form. They struck first. The initial wave didn't target randomly, didn't scatter across the fleet. It focused, immediately locking onto human vessels, isolating them before they could fully separate from the formation, cutting off angles, limiting movement, forcing them into positions where their usual tactics couldn't unfold properly. "They're predicting us," one pilot reported, his voice steady, but tighter than before. Because it wasn't just reaction anymore. It was expectation. The humans tried to adapt, shifting patterns, breaking even further from standard behavior, creating movements that should have been impossible to predict, but the Varkh followed. Not perfectly, but close enough. And that was all it took. The first loss came fast. A human strike ship, caught mid-maneuver, unable to complete its vector change before the Varkh closed the gap. Its systems hit in sequence, propulsion first, then targeting, then structural integrity collapsing under pressure that had been calculated, not improvised. It didn't disappear instantly. It fought, tried to recover, tried to push through, but the outcome had already been decided the moment the Varkh predicted its movement. The second loss came even faster. Then the third, and suddenly, the battlefield shifted completely. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was pressure, relentless, controlled, escalating. Coalition ships struggled to keep formation, their systems built around coordination and command, not independent reaction at that level of speed. And the human ships, the ones that had defined the battlefield at Kelros, now found themselves doing something they hadn't done before. Falling behind. Break formation, full adaptive engagement. A human commander ordered, abandoning structure entirely, allowing each unit to act on its own, to think, to react, to survive however it could. That should have changed everything. At Kelros it had. But not now. Because the Varkh had learned that too. They didn't try to control the entire battlefield anymore. They focused on fragments. Individual ships. Small groups. Breaking the chaos into something manageable. Something predictable. And slowly, the advantage disappeared. The fight stretched longer than expected, not because the fleet was holding strong, but because both sides were adapting in real time, pushing against each other, testing, adjusting, evolving within the same space. But there was one difference that mattered. The Varkh didn't get tired. They didn't hesitate. They didn't question. They only improved. And that gave them the edge. By the time the order to retreat was given, it was already too late to avoid heavy losses. Ships were damaged, others destroyed. And for the first time since humans had entered the war, the withdrawal wasn't controlled. It was forced. The fleet pulled back, breaking contact, escaping the system, but not with the same confidence they had carried before, not with the same sense of control, because this time they hadn't just faced resistance. They had been pushed back, and everyone felt it, not just in the numbers, but in what it meant. Back on the command ship, the silence after the battle was heavier than anything said during it, not because there were no answers, but because the answer was already clear. They were not ahead anymore. Lyra stared at the data, her hands still, her mind trying to process what she was seeing, the patterns, the timing, the precision, everything aligning in a way that left no room for doubt. "They're adapting faster than we can change," she said quietly. No one corrected her, because no one could. The report reached Earth within hours. Detailed, unfiltered, impossible to ignore. General Cross read it once, then again, slower the second time, focusing on the same sections, the same timestamps, the same sequences of events where the Varkh predicted human movement with increasing accuracy. "They're not just learning," he said finally. "They're accelerating." Dr. Bennett nodded. "They've moved past reactive adaptation," she added. "This is pattern anticipation." That was worse, much worse, because it meant that every tactic humanity developed, every strategy they relied on, was being absorbed faster than they could evolve it. President Morrison stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the full weight of it, not just the losses, not just the tactical shift, but what it meant long-term. "How long before they match us completely?" she asked. There was no immediate answer, not because they didn't know, but because they did, and saying it out loud made it real. "Soon," Bennett said, and that word carried more weight than any number ever could, because now the war had reached a point where strength was no longer enough, speed was no longer enough, unpredictability was no longer enough. Now it was a race, not to win, but to evolve faster than the enemy. And for the first time since stepping into the war, humanity wasn't sure it was winning that race. Part 3. Change or fall. The defeat didn't break humanity, but it changed it. That difference mattered, because humans were not a species that collapsed under pressure. They were a species that adapted to it, shaped by it, defined by it. And for 10,000 years they had lived without facing a real existential threat, without being forced to push beyond their limits, without needing to rediscover what made them dangerous in the first place. Now they remembered, and that memory wasn't comfortable. Inside Earth's command center, the atmosphere was different from anything the Coalition had experienced before, not filled with panic, not overwhelmed by fear, but sharpened, focused, controlled in a way that made the tension feel heavier instead of chaotic. Because this time, they knew exactly what they were facing. "They're closing the gap," General Cross said, his voice steady as the battle data replayed again, every movement mapped, every loss accounted for, every second broken down into something that could be understood. Jake Holland stood nearby, watching in silence, recognizing the patterns not just in the data, but in the behavior behind it, because he had seen something like this before, not the Varkh, not this scale, but the principle behind it. An enemy that learns. An enemy that doesn't stop. An enemy that adapts faster the more you fight it. "We can't outpace them forever," Jake said. No one disagreed, because that part was already clear. Speed had been their advantage. Unpredictability had been their advantage. Independent thinking had been their advantage. And now, all of it was being studied, broken down, turned into something the Varkh could counter. So we stopped playing that game, Cross replied. That was the shift. Not trying to stay ahead. Changing the rules completely. Dr. Bennett stepped forward, pulling up a new set of projections, simulations that didn't follow coalition logic, didn't follow previous human doctrine either, because this wasn't about refinement anymore. It was about transformation. They're adapting to patterns, she said. Even when we break structure, they find the underlying behavior. Decision timing, reaction windows, movement priorities, they're building predictive models. And if they can predict us, Cross continued, they can control the battlefield, Jake finished. Silence followed. Because that was the real threat. Not destruction. Control. The ability to shape the fight before it even happened. And that meant one thing. They needed to become something that couldn't be predicted. Not just faster. Not just stronger. Unreadable. The discussion shifted immediately, not into panic, but into design, into construction of something new, something that didn't exist before, something that would feel wrong even to human commanders. Decentralize further, Cross said. No shared tactical patterns, no synchronized timing, no predictable formations at any level. That creates chaos, one officer replied. Exactly, because chaos couldn't be mapped easily, couldn't be predicted cleanly. But even that wasn't enough. Jake looked at the simulation again, then spoke quietly. They're not just reading movement, they're reading intent. That made the room go still. Because intent wasn't something you could easily remove. It was built into decision-making itself. We need to delay decisions, he continued. Shorten reaction windows. Introduce randomness at the point of execution, not just in movement. You're suggesting controlled unpredictability, Bennett said. No, Jake answered. I'm suggesting we stop thinking like we need control. That was dangerous. Because control was what kept systems stable. It was what prevented collapse. But in this war, control was becoming a weakness. Cross nodded slowly. We train them to operate without certainty, he said. No full information, no fixed plans, no expectation of support. That increases risk, another voice added. Yes, Cross replied. It does. And no one argued after that. Because risk was already everywhere. The difference now was how it would be used. Orders were issued within hours. Human fleets began restructuring immediately, not just at a command level, but at an individual level. Pilots retrained to delay instinctive reactions, to break their own patterns, to act in ways that even they couldn't fully predict in advance. It was uncomfortable, counterintuitive, even dangerous, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, coalition forces struggled to keep up with the shift, their systems built on coordination, hierarchy, and structured execution, trying to integrate with something that rejected all of that in favor of something far less stable. Lyra watched the changes unfold with growing unease, analyzing the new training data, the behavioral adjustments, the breakdown of structure that had once defined both coalition and human operations. You're removing consistency, she said. Jake didn't deny it. Yes. That makes you harder to predict. Yes. But it also makes you harder to trust. That was the real cost. And Jake knew it. Trust doesn't matter if we lose, he said. That answer stayed with her. Because it wasn't just about tactics. It was about identity again. What humanity was willing to become, to survive. Far beyond their space, the Varkh continued evolving, their structures shifting, their coordination tightening, their responses accelerating as they processed the new data, the new behavior, the new patterns they were trying to understand. Because something had changed. Something they hadn't seen before. Something that didn't follow the same rules anymore. And for the first time since they entered coalition space, their adaptation slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Because what they were facing now was no longer consistent enough to map easily. Back on Earth, as the first simulations of the new combat doctrine ran, the results were unstable, unpredictable, sometimes effective, sometimes catastrophic, but there was one pattern that stood out. When it worked better than anything before. And when it failed completely. There was no middle ground. Cross watched the results in silence, then turned slightly. This is what it looks like now, he said. No one needed clarification. Because the meaning was clear. The war had changed again. Not into something more controlled, but into something more dangerous, more volatile, more uncertain, because now, both sides were evolving, and the next battle wouldn't be decided by who was stronger, but by who could survive their own strategy. Part 4. Controlled Chaos. The next battle didn't begin like the others. There was no clear formation, no unified line of advance, no structured positioning that could be mapped or predicted before the first shot was fired, because this time, there was no single plan guiding the fleet. That was intentional. The system they entered had already been marked as high risk, heavy Varkh presence, previous coalition losses, unstable control, exactly the kind of place where the old strategies had already failed and where the new approach would either prove itself or collapse completely. As the fleet dropped out of warp, the difference was immediate. Human ships didn't wait. They didn't align. They didn't synchronize. They scattered, not randomly, but without a visible pattern. Each vessel moving on its own vector, adjusting independently, delaying decisions until the last possible moment, forcing every movement to exist outside of any predictable sequence. Coalition ships followed, but with hesitation. Because this wasn't how they fought. This wasn't how war was supposed to work. But they had no choice. Because the Varkh were already there. And this time, they were ready. Their formation shifted the moment the fleet arrived. But something was different, something subtle but important. Their response wasn't immediate like before. There was a delay, small, almost insignificant, but enough to notice. "They're trying to read us," a pilot reported. And they couldn't. Not fully. Because there was no consistent pattern to read. The first exchange happened fast. Human ships engaged from multiple angles, some accelerating into the Varkh formation, others pulling away, others holding position longer than expected before moving. Every action slightly delayed, slightly altered, slightly different from what instinct alone would dictate. And for the first time since they started adapting, the Varkh hesitated, just for a moment. But that moment mattered. Weapons fired. Kinetic rounds cut through space, impacting Varkh structures before their defensive shifts could fully compensate, not because the weapons were new, but because the timing was off, just enough to break the predictive model they had been building. A Varkh unit was destroyed. Then another. The battlefield didn't stabilize. It became unstable, unpredictable. Human ships didn't coordinate their attacks in the traditional sense. They created pressure points, brief moments of advantage that appeared and disappeared quickly, forcing the Varkh to constantly adjust without ever fully locking into a reliable response. Coalition ships began adapting as well, slower, less precise, but learning, breaking their own formations, acting more independently than they ever had before. For a brief moment, it worked. The Varkh were pushed back, not overwhelmed, but disrupted, and that disruption was enough to create openings. More enemy units were destroyed, more space was created, more control gained. But the Varkh didn't stop adapting. They never did. Their movements started tightening again, not across the entire battlefield, but in localized zones, smaller areas where they focused their attention, reducing the scale of prediction, making it easier to process. "They're narrowing the field," Lyra said, watching the data. And that was the problem, because even chaos can be contained. One human ship pushed too far ahead, its movement slightly more aggressive than the others, its delay timing shorter, its pattern just consistent enough for the Varkh to lock onto. And this time, they didn't hesitate. They collapsed on it instantly. The attack was precise, fast, overwhelming in a way that bypassed the new strategy entirely, not by breaking it, but by isolating a moment where it failed. The ship didn't have time to adapt, didn't have time to escape. It was gone. And that changed the tone immediately, because the strategy worked. Until it didn't. Human ships adjusted again, increasing unpredictability even further, pushing the limits of control, delaying reactions longer, creating movements that even their own systems struggled to calculate in real time. And the battlefield became something else entirely. Not structured, not chaotic, something in between, something unstable. Losses came from both sides now, not overwhelming, not one-sided, but constant, pressure building in every direction, every decision carrying risk, every movement opening a possibility of success or failure. Coalition ships struggled under the pressure, their systems not designed for this level of independence, some adapting, others hesitating, and hesitation was still deadly. The battle stretched longer than expected, not because either side was dominating, but because neither side could fully control it. And that was new. By the time the Varkh finally pulled back, their formations breaking just enough to disengage, the outcome wasn't clear in the way previous battles had been. The system was not fully secured. The enemy was not destroyed, but they had been pushed back. Again, this time at a cost. Human losses, coalition losses, damage across the fleet, and something else. Uncertainty. Because this wasn't a clean victory. It was unstable, incomplete. Back on the command ship, no one celebrated. No one spoke immediately, because everyone understood what they had just experienced. "We can disrupt them," Lyra said quietly. Jake nodded. "Yes, but we can't control the outcome." And that was the truth. Because the strategy they had built didn't guarantee victory. It only created possibility. And possibility came with risk. Cross reviewed the battle data later, watching the same moments over and over. The points where chaos worked, the points where it failed, the moments where the Varkh adapted, where they struggled, where they recovered. "They're still learning," he said. Bennett nodded. "So are we." That was the balance now. Not dominance. Not control. Adaptation. On both sides. And the gap between them was no longer as wide as it had been. Somewhere in deep space, far beyond the battlefield, the Varkh continued to process everything. Every delay, every irregular movement, every unpredictable shift, building new models, new responses, new strategies designed to handle this new form of war. Because now, they understood something important. Humans were not consistent, and that made them harder to predict, but not impossible. And the next time they met, they would be ready for this too. Part 5, the counter. At first, it looked like the new strategy was holding. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to keep the Varkh from regaining full control of the battlefield, enough to slow their adaptation, enough to create space where there had been none before, and for a brief period, that was enough to keep the war from collapsing completely. But that balance didn't last, because the Varkh were no longer just reacting to chaos. They were studying it. Every delayed movement, every irregular decision, every moment where human ships broke their own patterns to avoid prediction, all of it was being observed, processed, broken down into something that could be understood at a deeper level, something beyond simple trajectory or timing. They started looking for something else. Consistency inside the inconsistency. And eventually, they found it. The next battle made that clear immediately. The fleet entered a contested system expecting resistance, expecting adaptation, expecting pressure, but what they encountered wasn't just an evolved version of previous behavior. It was something new. The Varkh didn't try to predict every movement anymore. They didn't try to control the entire battlefield. Instead, they reduced it. Localized engagement zones formed almost instantly, smaller areas where the number of variables could be limited, where chaos itself could be compressed into something manageable, something that could be analyzed faster. "They're isolating decision spaces," Bennett said as the data came in. And that was exactly what they were doing. Instead of trying to read the entire fight, the Varkh forced it into fragments. And inside those fragments, chaos became predictable again. Human ships entered the engagement the same way they had before, splitting, delaying, breaking patterns, creating unpredictable vectors. But this time, the response came differently. Not delayed, not confused, focused. Each Varkh unit committed to a smaller section of the battlefield, ignoring everything outside its assigned zone, reducing complexity, increasing accuracy, and within those zones, the predictions started to return. Not fully, but enough. The first human ship caught in one of those zones didn't realize it immediately. Its movement remained irregular, its timing delayed, its path shifting constantly, but within that smaller space, the Varkh didn't need full prediction. They only needed enough. They adjusted once, then again, then they locked. The attack came faster than expected, cleaner, more efficient. The ship was destroyed before it could fully break out of the zone. "They're adapting to the structure of chaos," Lyra said, her voice tighter now, because this wasn't just evolution. This was understanding, and that was worse, because it meant the Varkh were no longer chasing human unpredictability. They were shaping it. The battle escalated quickly after that. Human ships tried to expand their engagement range, breaking further apart, increasing distance, trying to avoid being trapped in those localized zones. But that created new problems, new vulnerabilities, new gaps that the Varkh immediately exploited. Coalition ships struggled even more, caught between two evolving systems of combat, unable to fully adapt to the speed of human decisions while also failing to anticipate the precision of the Varkh response. The battlefield became tighter, more dangerous, more controlled by the enemy than before. Losses increased, not drastically, but consistently, and that consistency was what mattered, because it showed a trend, a direction, a shift. "They're stabilizing against us," a pilot reported, and no one corrected him, because it was true. The chaotic advantage was still there, but it was shrinking. Every minute of combat, every exchange, every engagement gave the Varkh more data, more refinement, more understanding of how to contain something that was designed to be uncontrollable. And slowly, they were succeeding. The turning point came when multiple zones overlapped. For the first time, the Varkh coordinated their localized strategy, merging isolated spaces into larger controlled areas, not fully restoring their previous dominance, but creating pressure points strong enough to break through human adaptability. 3 human ships were caught at once. No escape vector, no unpredictable path left. Every option already narrowed. The fight lasted seconds. They didn't make it out. That moment changed everything, because it proved something that had only been theoretical until then. The new strategy could be countered. Not easily, not completely, but enough to matter. The order to disengage came later than it should have, because no one wanted to accept it. No one wanted to admit that the advantage was slipping again, but when it finally came, the withdrawal wasn't clean. It wasn't controlled. It was pressured. The fleet pulled back, leaving the system contested, leaving the outcome unresolved, leaving behind something worse than defeat. Doubt. Back in command, the analysis didn't take long. It didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. "They're learning how to contain unpredictability," Bennett said. Cross didn't respond immediately, because that conclusion had implications far beyond a single battle. "If they fully stabilize against this," he said slowly. Jake finished the thought. "Then we run out of options." Silence followed, because that wasn't just a tactical problem. It was an endpoint. The strategy that had allowed humanity to enter the war, to break the Varkh advance, to create momentum, was no longer guaranteed to work, and there was nothing ready to replace it. Outside, the war continued. Systems still contested, fleets still moving. But now, something had changed again. Not in favor of one side, but in balance. A balance that was becoming more unstable with every battle. More dangerous, more unpredictable, because now, both sides understood each other, and the next evolution would decide everything. Part 6. The line they never wanted to cross. The problem wasn't just that the Varkh were adapting again. It was that they were getting closer to something humanity had always tried to avoid, something buried deep in their history, something they had chosen to lock away 10,000 years ago because of what it had cost them the last time they used it. And now, for the first time since returning to war, that possibility was no longer theoretical, it was becoming necessary. Back in command, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something heavier, something more deliberate, because this wasn't about adjusting tactics anymore. It wasn't about refining movement or improving coordination. It was about deciding whether they were willing to cross a line they had spent millennia avoiding. "They're stabilizing faster than we can destabilize," Bennett said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller, because everyone understood what that meant. It meant the current approach had a limit, and that limit was getting closer with every engagement. Cross stood still for a moment, looking at the projections, not the current battles, but the ones that hadn't happened yet, the ones that would define the next phase of the war, and every simulation pointed in the same direction. Not immediate collapse, not instant defeat, but something worse, a slow loss of advantage, a gradual narrowing of options until there were none left. Jake already knew where this was going before anyone said it, because he had seen the same pattern before, not in this war, but in the last one humanity had fought, the one that had forced them into isolation, the one they never talked about anymore. "We're running out of space," he said quietly, and that wasn't about territory, it was about possibility, about how many ways they could still fight before every path led to the same outcome. No one disagreed, because the numbers didn't lie, and the Varkh didn't stop. "They're not just learning what we do," Bennett continued. "They're learning how we decide." That was the real threat, because once an enemy understands your decision-making process, It doesn't just react to your actions, it moves ahead of them, shaping the fight before you even commit to it. Cross finally turned. There is one option left, he said. And the silence that followed was immediate, not because they didn't understand what he meant, but because they did, and no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Jake looked at him. You said we would never go back to that. Cross didn't look away. I said we shouldn't, he replied, and there was a difference between those two things that everyone in that room felt instantly. Because shouldn't leaves room. Room for necessity. Room for survival. Room for decisions that no one wants to make, but might have to. Bennett hesitated for the first time. If we activate that system, she started, then stopped. Not because she didn't know the consequences, but because saying them out loud would make the decision real in a way that couldn't be undone. Jake finished it for her. We lose control. And that was the truth. Not partial. Not theoretical. Absolute. Because what they were talking about wasn't just another weapon. It wasn't just another strategy. It was something designed for a different kind of war. A war where survival mattered more than stability. Where victory justified risks that no structured system could safely contain. It's the only thing they won't be able to predict, Cross said. And that was the point. Because the Varkh thrived on patterns, on structure, on decision-making processes that could be mapped, analyzed, anticipated. But this wasn't structured. This wasn't controlled. This wasn't even fully understood. And that made it dangerous. Not just for the enemy. For everyone. Lyra had been silent until that moment. Watching the data, listening, trying to understand what they were really considering. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried something different. Not fear exactly, but concern at a level deeper than anything she had felt before. You're talking about removing the limiters, aren't you? No one answered immediately, because that was exactly what it was. Limiters. The systems humanity had built into its own war doctrines to prevent escalation beyond control, to keep their adaptability from turning into something destructive not just to the enemy, but to the structure of the battlefield itself. Jake exhaled slowly. If we do this, we don't just change how we fight, he said. We change what we are in this war. Cross nodded. Yes. No hesitation. No attempt to soften it. Because there was nothing to soften. Outside, the war didn't pause for their decision. Fleets were still engaging, systems still contested, lives still being lost, and with every passing moment, the Varkh were refining their understanding, tightening their control, reducing the effectiveness of everything humanity had brought into the fight. Time wasn't neutral. It was pressure, and it was building. President Morrison entered the room without announcement, already aware of the discussion, already understanding the direction it was taking, because she had seen the same projections, the same simulations, the same narrowing of outcomes that left fewer and fewer viable paths forward. Tell me the cost, she said. No one tried to avoid the question, because this time, there was no version of the answer that sounded acceptable. Cross spoke first. We increase our adaptability beyond current limits. We remove behavioral constraints. We allow full, autonomous decision scaling across all combat units. That's the benefit, she said. Yes. And the cost. That was where the silence returned. Not because they didn't know, but because they did. Jake looked at her. We lose predictability, he said, and that didn't sound like much on the surface. But in war, predictability isn't just a weakness. It's also stability. It's what keeps forces coordinated, what prevents collapse, what ensures that your own side can function as a system instead of breaking into uncontrolled fragments. And if we lose that, she asked. Bennett answered this time. Then we're not controlling the battlefield anymore, she said. We're surviving inside it. That was the line. Clear. Unavoidable. Because up until now, even in chaos, even in unpredictability, humanity still had a degree of control, a framework, a boundary that defined how far things could go. Removing that boundary meant stepping into something else entirely. Morrison stood there for a moment, processing everything, not just the tactical implications, but the long-term consequences, what it meant for humanity, for the coalition, for the war itself. And then she made the decision. We do it. No hesitation. No delay. Because at that point, there was no safe option left. Only necessary ones. Orders were issued immediately. Systems that had been locked for thousands of years began to come online. Protocols reactivated, restrictions lifted, parameters expanded beyond what current combat doctrine allowed. And across the human fleet, something subtle but profound began to change. Not in their ships, not in their weapons, in their behavior. The next battle would not be like the last. Not controlled chaos, not structured unpredictability. Something deeper, something more dangerous, something the Varkh had never faced before. And maybe, something humanity wouldn't be able to fully control once it started. Part 7. Unleashed. The change didn't look dramatic at first. There was no visible transformation in the ships, no new weapons being deployed, no sudden shift in formation or structure that could be easily identified from the outside. And that was exactly what made it dangerous, because what had changed wasn't what the humans used to fight, it was how they chose to fight. Across the fleet, the limiters were gone, not removed in a reckless or uncontrolled way, but released, allowing every pilot, every system, every decision process to operate without the constraints that had once defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And at first, the difference was subtle, almost invisible, just slight delays, unexpected accelerations, movements that didn't align with previous patterns even within the new chaotic doctrine. But then the battle began. The fleet entered contested space expecting resistance, expecting adaptation, expecting the Varkh to respond the way they had in the previous engagements, isolating zones, narrowing decision spaces, forcing chaos into something predictable, something manageable. But this time, that didn't happen. Because the moment the first engagement started, the human response broke something deeper than structure. It broke expectation. Ships didn't just move unpredictably anymore. They moved without consistency, even within their own behavior. Decisions were no longer delayed in patterns that could be tracked. They happened at irregular intervals, sometimes instant, sometimes held longer than logic would allow, sometimes reversed mid-execution, forcing every possible predictive model to fail before it could stabilize. The Varkh reacted immediately, attempting to isolate engagement zones the way they had before, trying to compress the battlefield into smaller spaces where chaos could be reduced. But this time, those zones didn't hold. Because the humans didn't stay within them. They broke them. Not by force, by behavior. Ships would enter a zone, then exit before the pattern could be established, or remain longer than expected, drawing in multiple Varkh units before shifting direction in a way that didn't follow any previous logic, turning what should have been controlled environments into unstable clusters of movement that collapsed under their own unpredictability. They can't map it, a pilot reported, and for the first time in multiple engagements, there was something different in his voice. Not confidence, but surprise, because the Varkh response was slower. Not dramatically, not enough to call it failure, but enough to notice. Their targeting adjusted, their formations shifted, but each reaction came just slightly too late, each prediction just slightly off, and that gap, small as it was, created something that hadn't existed before. Opportunity. Human ships pushed into that gap immediately, not in coordinated waves, not in structured attacks, but in bursts of action that appeared and disappeared without warning, kinetic strikes landing before the Varkh defenses could fully adapt, impacts tearing through structures that would have resisted them in previous battles. One Varkh unit collapsed, then another, and then something changed again. The Varkh attempted to recalibrate, pulling back from full engagement, reducing their exposure, trying to rebuild predictive models from the new data, but the data itself wasn't consistent enough to stabilize. Because there was no pattern. Not anymore. They're losing sync, Lyra said, watching the streams of information shift in ways she hadn't seen before. Because the Varkh weren't failing completely, they were fragmenting, each unit adjusting differently, each response slightly misaligned from the others. And that misalignment was enough. Human ships exploited it immediately, not through coordination, but through instinct amplified beyond previous limits. Decisions made faster, risk thresholds pushed further, actions taken that would have been rejected under any controlled system. A ship dove directly through a Varkh cluster, not avoiding impact, not minimizing exposure, but using the collision vector itself to disrupt the formation, forcing multiple enemy units to adjust simultaneously, creating a cascade of delayed reactions that spread outward. It worked, but barely. The ship was heavily damaged, almost lost, and still, it stayed in the fight. Because the limiters were gone, pain thresholds, risk calculations, survival prioritization, all reduced, all secondary. What mattered now? was effect. The battlefield shifted faster than ever before, no longer stabilizing even briefly, no longer forming recognizable patterns on either side, just constant motion, constant adaptation, constant pressure applied in ways that couldn't be predicted or contained. And for the first time since the war began, the Varkh began to fall back. Not reposition, not regroup, fall back. Their formations breaking earlier than before, their engagement zones collapsing instead of tightening, their response cycles extending beyond optimal thresholds, creating openings that didn't close in time. They're disengaging, a coalition officer said, almost disbelieving it. Because this wasn't like before. This wasn't controlled retreat. This was loss of control. The human fleet didn't pursue recklessly, not because they couldn't, but because even without limiters, some level of awareness remained, enough to recognize that pushing too far into unknown territory carried risks they couldn't measure yet. The battle ended without a clean finish. The system wasn't fully secured. The enemy wasn't destroyed. But the result was clear. The Varkh had been forced back by something they couldn't fully understand. Back on the command level, the analysis came in fast, but the interpretation took longer because what they were looking at didn't fit into any existing framework. Not coalition, not human, not even theoretical. They couldn't predict us, Bennett said. Cross nodded slowly. No, he replied. They couldn't. Jake stood there, watching the replay, seeing the moments where decisions were made without hesitation, without constraint, without the internal limits that had always guided human behavior in war. We broke their model, he said. And that was true, but only partially, because the Varkh were still adapting. They always were. And this was just the next thing they would learn. The difference now was time, because for the first time, humanity had created something the Varkh couldn't immediately process. And that delay might be the only advantage they had left, but it came with a cost, because the more they relied on this, the harder it would be to go back. And somewhere beyond the battlefield, the Varkh were already beginning to analyze this new behavior, this deeper layer of unpredictability, this absence of constraint, searching for patterns where none were meant to exist. Because they didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They didn't give up. They learned. And the next time they faced this, they would be ready. Part 8. Losing control. At first, it felt like power. Not the kind of power that comes from stronger weapons or larger fleets, but something deeper, something internal, the kind that changes the way decisions are made, the way risk is perceived, the way survival itself is calculated. Because with the limiters gone, human pilots were no longer thinking in terms of preservation. They were thinking in terms of impact, effect, outcome, and for a brief moment, that shift gave them something they hadn't had since the war began. Dominance. But that feeling didn't last. Because the same change that made them unpredictable to the Varkh made them unpredictable to each other. The first signs were small, subtle enough to ignore at first, easy to explain as battlefield pressure or individual variation, slight delays in response coordination, ships pushing further than expected before disengaging, pilots taking risks that bordered on unnecessary, not because they were reckless, but because their perception of acceptable loss had shifted. And that shift was growing. Back in command, the data streams didn't show a collapse, not immediately, but they showed something else, something more concerning, a gradual divergence in behavior, not from the enemy, but within the human fleet itself, patterns that no longer aligned even loosely, decision trees that didn't converge the way they used to. They're drifting, Bennett said, her voice quieter now, not because the data was unclear, but because it was becoming too clear. Cross didn't respond immediately, because he saw it too, not just in the numbers, but in the timing, in the way engagements unfolded, in the way pilots chose to stay in combat longer than necessary, pushing beyond thresholds that used to trigger automatic withdrawal. They're staying in the fight too long, he said. And that wasn't a tactical advantage. It was a warning, because without limiters, there was nothing forcing disengagement at the right moment, nothing enforcing the balance between aggression and survival. And while that created opportunities against the Varkh, it also created risk. Uncontrolled risk. The next battle made that impossible to ignore. It started like the last one, unpredictable movement, fragmented engagement, constant shifting across the battlefield, the Varkh struggling to stabilize their response, reacting slower than before, falling back under pressure that didn't follow any consistent logic. At first it worked again. Human ships pushed deep into Varkh formations, breaking clusters, creating gaps, forcing reactions that came too late, too misaligned, too slow to contain what was happening. But then, something changed. Not on the Varkh side. On theirs. One ship didn't pull back. It should have. Every indicator showed it was time to disengage, structural integrity dropping, systems failing, enemy units converging, every signal pointing to withdrawal. But the pilot stayed. Not frozen. Not malfunctioning. Choosing to stay. Trying to push just a little further, to create just a little more impact, to take advantage of one more opening before leaving. And that decision cost everything. The ship was surrounded. Not instantly. Not in a way that couldn't be avoided. But in a way that required a decision to escape. And that decision came too late. The ship was lost. Silence followed on the comms. Not because no one noticed, but because everyone did, and they understood exactly what had happened. Not a failure of systems, not a failure of strategy, but a failure of restraint. And that was new. The battle continued, but the shift was there now, spreading, subtle but undeniable. More ships pushing further than they should, more engagements extending beyond safe limits, more moments where survival became secondary to outcome. They're overcommitting, Lyra said, watching the data tighten into something uncomfortable. Jake didn't argue, because he had felt it too. That pull, that drive to keep going just a little longer, to push just a little harder, to not step back when instinct said to stop. Because the limiters weren't there anymore. And instinct alone wasn't enough to replace them. The Varkh didn't miss it. They never did. They adjusted quickly, not to the chaos this time, but to the extension of it, recognizing the moments where human ships stayed too long, where their unpredictability stretched into exposure, where opportunity turned into vulnerability. And they exploited it. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough. The battle became uneven, not because one side dominated, but because control was slipping in small, critical moments, moments that decided whether a ship survived or didn't. Another human vessel was lost. Then another. Not because the strategy failed, but because it went too far. The order to disengage came earlier this time, sharper, more immediate, not because the situation demanded it, but because command had seen enough. The risk wasn't just external anymore. It was internal. The fleet pulled back, breaking contact, leaving the battlefield behind. But this time, the silence that followed wasn't about the enemy. It was about themselves. Back in command, the analysis didn't take long. It didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. We're losing cohesion, Bennett said. Cross nodded slowly. Yes. And if that continues. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Because the conclusion was obvious. If they lost cohesion completely, they didn't just lose the war. They lost control of their own forces. Jake leaned forward slightly, his expression tighter now, not from fear, but from recognition. We pushed too far, he said. And that was the truth. The very thing that had given them an advantage was starting to break them. President Morrison stood in silence, absorbing the report, not just the losses, not just the tactical implications, but the direction everything was moving in. And for the first time since making the decision to remove the limiters, doubt appeared. Not about the enemy, about the choice. How long before this becomes irreversible, she asked. Bennett answered quietly. It already is, if we don't adjust. That was the line now. Not between victory and defeat, but between control and collapse. Outside, the war continued. The Varkh still advancing, still adapting, still learning. But now, something else had entered the equation. Something just as dangerous. Humanity itself. Because the more they relied on this new way of fighting, the closer they got to something they might not be able to come back from. And the next battle would decide whether they could still control it, or if they had already gone too far. Part 9. Hold the line or let go. The problem was no longer just the enemy. That realization didn't come all at once. It didn't arrive as a single conclusion or a clear statement inside command. It grew slowly, built from reports, from behavior, from the subtle but undeniable shift in how human forces were operating, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. They were winning ground, but they were losing something else. And the balance between those two things was becoming harder to maintain with every battle. Inside command, the discussions had changed tone completely, no longer focused only on the Varkh, no longer centered purely on strategy or adaptation, but on something far more complicated, something that didn't have a clean solution. Control, or the loss of it. They're still effective, one officer said, pointing to the latest battle reports, showing systems held, enemy units destroyed, advances slowed. Yes, Bennett replied, but look at the cost. And the cost wasn't just ships. It wasn't just numbers. It was behavior. Engagement durations increasing beyond safe thresholds, reaction windows becoming inconsistent, pilots ignoring optimal withdrawal points not out of failure, but out of choice, pushing further, staying longer, risking more than they should. They're starting to prioritize outcome over survival, Cross said. Jake nodded slightly. They already are. And that was the problem. Because without that balance, there was no stability, no structure, no guarantee that the system would hold together under pressure. The room fell into silence for a moment, not because there were no solutions, but because every solution carried a cost that no one wanted to accept. Reintroduce limiters, someone suggested. It sounded simple, logical, safe. But Jake shook his head. It won't work the same way anymore, he said, and his voice carried certainty, not doubt. Why not? The officer asked. Because they've already felt what it's like without them, Jake answered, and that changed everything. Because once a system experiences full freedom of decision, full removal of constraint, going back doesn't restore balance. It creates friction, resistance, conflict inside the decision process itself. They won't respond the same way, Bennett added. Their behavior has already adapted. So we just let this continue, another voice pushed. And that question hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it wasn't just about tactics anymore. It was about direction, about what kind of force humanity was becoming in this war. Cross stepped forward slightly. We don't let it continue uncontrolled, he said. We redefine the boundaries. Not removing the strategy, not abandoning it, but reshaping it. Partial limiters? Bennett asked. Adaptive ones, Cross replied. Not fixed thresholds, but dynamic constraints that respond to context, not override behavior completely, but guide it. Jake considered that for a moment. That slows them down, he said. Yes, Cross answered. And if it slows them too much, we lose the advantage. There it was again. The same trade-off. Control, or effectiveness, safety, or dominance. And there was no version of this war where both existed perfectly at the same time. President Morrison stood at the center of the room, listening to every argument, every projection, every risk being calculated, and she understood what this really was. Not a tactical decision, a philosophical one. Who they were willing to be to win. If we keep pushing without control, we risk collapse, Bennett said. If we restrict too much, we lose the edge, Cross added. Jake looked at Morrison. And if we hesitate, we lose time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. Outside, the war was still moving, the Varkh still adapting, still closing gaps, still learning from every engagement, and the longer this decision took, the more the balance would shift again. Morrison took a slow breath, then spoke. We don't go back, she said. That alone changed the room, because it meant one thing. There was no returning to what they were before. But we don't let this escalate unchecked either, she continued, and now the direction was clear. We implement adaptive limiters, not to control every action, but to prevent collapse. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't clean, but it was the only path forward that didn't lead immediately to one extreme or the other. Orders were issued quickly after that. Adjustments made across the fleet, systems updated, behavioral frameworks modified, not to restore the old structure, but to create something new, something in between. Controlled freedom, guided unpredictability, a balance that had never been tested in a war like this. Jake watched the changes roll out, knowing it wouldn't be easy, knowing it might not even work the way they hoped, because once a system starts to evolve, forcing it into a new shape carries its own risks. They're going to fight it, he said quietly. Bennett nodded. Yes, some more than others. And that was another problem. Because not every pilot would adapt the same way. Not every mind would accept the reintroduction of limits, even adaptive ones. And that meant internal variation, internal instability. But it was still better than letting everything fall apart. Far beyond their space, the Varkh continued to process the new data, the extended engagement times, the behavioral shifts, the moments of overcommitment, the patterns that emerged when control began to slip, and they learned from that too. Because they always did. And now, they weren't just studying how humans fought. They were studying how they changed. And that might be even more valuable. Back in the fleet, the updates completed, the systems adjusted, the pilots briefed, the next engagement was already forming. Another contested system, another clash waiting to happen, another test of whether this new balance could hold or break. Because now, the war wasn't just about defeating the Varkh. It was about holding on to something else at the same time. Themselves. And the next battle would decide which one mattered more. Part 10. The Edge of Control. The next battle didn't feel like the previous ones. There was no sense of momentum, no illusion of control, no confidence that what had been built would hold under pressure, because this time, both sides were entering the fight already changed, already aware, already adapting to something deeper than tactics. The fleet moved into position slowly, not because they hesitated, but because every system was now operating under a new balance, the adaptive limiters active, not restricting movement completely, but shaping it, influencing decisions without overriding them, creating resistance where there had been none before. And that resistance was felt. Pilots adjusted to it differently, some adapting quickly, integrating the constraints into their decision-making without losing flow, others fighting it, pushing against the boundaries, trying to maintain the same level of freedom they had before, creating slight inconsistencies that weren't visible individually, but together formed something unstable. Jake watched the data as it streamed in, already seeing the divergence. "It's not synchronized," he said. Bennett nodded. "It won't be," she replied, because that was the cost of what they had chosen, not full control, not full freedom, something in between that had never been tested at this scale. And now it would be. The fleet dropped out of warp. The Varkh were already there, waiting. But this time, they didn't rush. They didn't immediately engage. They observed. That alone changed the atmosphere. Because it meant one thing. They were learning even before the first move. The first engagement began without a clear trigger, small interactions forming across the battlefield, human ships moving, adjusting, testing the limits of their new behavior, coalition forces following, more structured, but trying to integrate the new rhythm, trying to exist inside a system that didn't fully match their own. The Varkh responded carefully, not aggressively, not passively, measured, each movement controlled, each reaction delayed just enough to gather more data, more understanding, more clarity on what had changed since the last encounter. "They're analyzing in real time," Lyra said. Jake didn't respond, because he expected it. The first exchange of fire broke the tension, kinetic rounds cutting across space, impacting Varkh units before their defenses fully shifted. But this time, the response came faster than before, not perfect, not immediate, but closer. Closer than it should have been. The adaptive limiters were working. But so were the Varkh. Human ships pushed forward, breaking patterns, shifting vectors, creating unpredictable movement. But now there was friction, small delays introduced by the limiters, moments where instinct was checked, where decisions were slightly altered, and those moments were visible, not to the humans, but to the Varkh. "They see it," Bennett said, her voice tightening. Because the Varkh weren't trying to predict chaos anymore. They were looking for constraint, for boundaries, for the subtle structure that remained inside human behavior. And slowly, they started to find it. The battlefield began to stabilize in fragments again, not fully controlled, not fully predictable, but enough for the Varkh to regain partial synchronization, their units aligning more consistently, their responses tightening, their engagement zones reforming. Human ships broke those zones, but not as cleanly as before, the limiters pulling slightly, guiding decisions away from extremes, preventing overcommitment, but also reducing the sharpness of their unpredictability. "It's working, but it's slowing us," a pilot reported. And that was the balance. The same system that prevented collapse was limiting dominance. The fight escalated. Pressure built across multiple points. Varkh units pushing harder now, more confident, more stable, their adaptations catching up, their models refining faster than before, because now there was something to map again. Not full structure, but enough. Losses came on both sides. Not overwhelming, not decisive, but steady. And that steadiness was dangerous, because it meant the war was leveling. A human ship broke formation too aggressively, pushing past the limiter's influence, diving deep into a Varkh cluster, trying to create a disruption like before, and for a moment, it worked. The formation broke. Openings appeared. Opportunity. But this time, the Varkh were ready. They collapsed inward instantly, not reacting late, not hesitating, their prediction sharper, their timing tighter, and the ship, unable to disengage in time, was caught, lost, and the system adjusted immediately. The limiter response kicked in across nearby units, pulling others back before they could repeat the same mistake, preventing a chain reaction, preventing escalation, containing the damage. It saved the rest, Bennett said. Jake nodded. But it cost the push. And that was the trade. Clear. Unavoidable. The battle continued like that, neither side fully breaking the other, neither side gaining decisive control, just constant pressure, constant adjustment, constant evolution on both ends, until finally, the Varkh disengaged. Not in retreat, not in defeat, but in calculation, pulling back at a point where further engagement no longer gave them enough advantage, preserving their forces, ending the fight on their own terms. The fleet held position, damaged, intact, uncertain, because the result wasn't clear. It wasn't a loss, but it wasn't a victory either. Back in command, the analysis began immediately, data flowing, models updating, projections shifting, and the conclusion came quickly, even if no one wanted to say it first. We stabilized, Cross said. Bennett nodded. Yes. Jake looked at the display. And so did they. That was the reality. The adaptive limiters had prevented collapse, but they had also allowed the Varkh to regain ground. Not territory, understanding. And in this war, that mattered just as much. President Morrison stood in silence, absorbing the outcome, not as a success or failure, but as a state. A balance. Unstable. Temporary. We didn't lose, she said. No, Cross replied. But we didn't win either. And that was worse than it sounded. Because it meant the war had reached a point where neither side could easily overcome the other, where every advantage was met with adaptation, every shift answered with evolution, every step forward matched by resistance. A stalemate, but not a safe one, because stalemates don't last. They break, one way or another. Far beyond the battlefield, the Varkh processed everything, the new constraints, the adjusted behavior, the restored patterns, the balance between chaos and control, and they learned from it, refining their models again, preparing for the next phase. Because they weren't done. They never were. And neither was humanity. Because now, the war had entered something new. Not domination, not collapse, a balance on the edge. And everyone involved knew the truth. The next shift would decide everything. If you're enjoying stories like this and want to dive deeper into mind-bending sci-fi that makes you question reality itself, make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to drop a like. Thanks for watching. See ya.